Thanks, Luis. And hi, everybody. It's good to be back with TLDC. And I'm geeked for this platform, right? So all of us in this space are probably like, ooh, platforms. And a different, so I'm geeked for the platform. I'm geeked. I love this community. And really honored to be able to kick things off with a big set of conversations. So I'm the CEO and founder at Torrance Learning, and I'd like to introduce Jessica Jackson, who joined Torrance Learning a couple years ago.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Jess. I like to say I'm a community architect with heart, and that means I strategically design and facilitate community with love. And I kind of got that away with my certification in college. I learned how to do intergroup dialogue and have difficult and change-making conversations with folks across different identities. So as we have this conversation today, it's really important that both Megan and I are engaging from our different perspectives and identities. I came into L&D with over a decade of experience in educational context, working to help support diverse learners and diverse populations to gain access to quality education in higher education. That meant I did a lot of strategic planning, strategic framework building, and I'm excited to partner with Torrance Learning on cultivating racial equity in the workplace, which is our framework for building racial equity in our workplaces. So today, Megan and I are both facilitating this conversation, and that's really important as we engage around racial equity. So I'm going to pass that over to Megan to kind of give a little more insight into what CREW is.
Yeah, well, and let's. How many sentences or conversations have you had that said, what I learned in 2020 was, 2020 was a really interesting year. We can, on a bunch of different levels, right? With the pandemic, I really was very aware of L&D's opportunity to serve as a first responder for organizations, right? How do we help organizations acquire necessary knowledge that is emerging constantly, daily, and changing? And how do we help our organizations change processes, procedures, and work practices in order to respond, right? So that's huge, right? Mm-hmm. And then we had a big reawakening this summer around racial equity. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about that. And honestly, I had not been doing a lot of thinking about that in the past. And we're going to get into that. What I am also now aware of is, in addition to that first responder, is that we have a unique voice in the organizations that we serve. And it's not just the DEI course. It's not just the inclusion and the harassment courses. What it is, right, every single other course that we build, every single other learning experience that we provide is an opportunity to send an organization, right, send the organization's message about equity to everyone. It's what we say, it's how we say it, and it's how we build it. And that's really what we're going to talk about today, right? So we're going to talk about building the foundation, right? And we see three batches of effort here, right? One is building the foundation, which starts with us. One is taking action, because I will tell you from personal experience, once I am aware, then I am fired up and want to do something about it, right? And I need something concrete. The awareness in and of itself is powerful. The action, right? Then it gives direction to that action, but then also we have a role in that cultural space, and we want to provide some resources there. And we don't have an opportunity today to necessarily go into the depth of all this. And Jess and I are actually working on a longer workshop around this, specifically for L&D and how we support this. But just can you frame how we engage here? Because what I love about TLDC, and I realize this is your introduction to TLDC, but what I love about this is the community and the conversation. So how do we make this a safe space?
Yeah. And I think that what we need to recognize when we come into any conversation like this is that we're all coming in with different perspectives, right? So Megan shared today, I started grappling with this really intensely this summer, right? I've been grappling with this for 10 years. Over 10 years at this point. So when we think about who's coming into the room to have these conversations that are necessary for change making, for learning, for folks to move forward, we have to also recognize that we're coming in with different lenses, different perspectives, different life experiences. And so when we build that foundation, when we're all gaining some self-awareness, and sometimes self-awareness is a slap in the face a little bit, like, oh, I've been doing these things causing harms. And so what we do to open up those spaces where we're starting to share and have conversation and engage and sometimes be triggered is set some norms, set some community standards for engagement. Think about what you need for everyone to feel safe. We're not going to say that the conversation is going to be comfortable, because we can't promise that, especially when you're on your learning edge. And we like to say that being on your learning edge is where the real magic happens, right? So we're going to promise safety, where we're going to have psychological safety. There are no negative consequences or judgment for things you don't know or you haven't engaged with. But we can't promise comfort. So setting up that standard from the front is really important. And then working with your group, whoever's in the room, to kind of share out norms and standards for what they need in order to feel safe in the space. A lot of times things come up around your triggers. How are you going to acknowledge your triggers? Does that mean you're going to step away and take a pause? Does it mean that you're going to have to do some personal reflection? A lot of times the conversation is around widening your perspective. A norm that might be set is around widening your perspective. It might be around how you navigate differences with respect. But there are all types of norms that you can be setting with your team or whoever you have these difficult conversations with, to make sure that everybody in the space feels like their contributions are valued, is welcome, and that they have access to learning.
And what's interesting about all of this, right? And so, and I'm fortunate, let's talk about this, Jess, here. I'm fortunate that I have Jess to help me along my learning process. And I've had some I ask lots of awkward questions, naive questions, and my edge is that I am cautious that I may be triggering or offensive in asking those. And yet if I don't ask and learn, right? And so I'm asking and learning and reading and doing all sorts of stuff, having uncomfortable conversations on Jess's front porch, standing 6 feet apart from each other. But but I don't want you to think that, and Jess is one of 2 people of color at Torrance Learning. I don't want you to think that the nearest person of color is necessarily your personal guide in this, like Jessica has been for me. So Jess, can we talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, like I said in my introduction, this is what I study. This is my passion. This is like part of my life work, right? And so every role that I've ever had, I've been kind of an equity consultant. And so I think that it's really important as you're navigating how to have appropriate relationships with diverse teams, not to think that they have the responsibility or that they want the responsibility to be your educator or informant. This is my work. It can feel very tokenizing. It can feel very disempowering to be expected to be the educator around this work. So we want to instead empower you to take your own steps, to do your own learning. So we have lots of resources, which we'll share in the end, that you can go on and continue your learning. We are also resources and we want to be partners with you. So if you want to reach out to us, we can help you there. But really don't try to put the pressure of other folks who come from marginalized identities in your workplace to be the lead experts on racial equity or any form of equity, because that's not a fair expectation and that actually causes more harm.
And I think, and Jess, you touched on this just a little bit, right? So we're talking about racial equity, right? And many, but not all, many of the concepts that we're talking here also can be applied in other context, right? There's the concept of intersectionality, our differing identities around gender and physical ability and ethnicity and things like that all come into play here. And so many, but again, not all of those are applicable in this space, or you can use some of these constructs here. And I think Judy's got a really great point, right? I mean, this is, we're not asking, right, our colleagues to speak for their people. I think that's a great phrase, right? And it is emotional and it is heavy, and so that's a big piece there. So let's talk about, we kind of touched on this, identities. Right? But there's really we see three main sets of activities. And I want to frame this up. It's not that Jess and I think it's a simple 1, 2, 3, bam, you're great. Racial equity is achieved and we all go home happy. We have three sets of activities, and think of that as we're chunking it for you. Instructional designer to instructional designer, right? So we're chunking it for you. And the first one is really around awareness and awareness of identity. So I'm from the, the historically centered population, right? And I, because of that identity, actually have a ton of blind spots around any other identities. I have some keen sensitivities around some aspects of my identity. And then we've actually created an identities, it's an opportunity to explore your identities and how they impact in the resource guide. And that's an activity that we have used with several different groups now, and it's been really powerful, and we really have gotten some good starts for conversations there. I mean, I'll just kind of put it right out there. When I was growing up, I was taught that the most polite thing I could do was to not talk about race. Right? I talk it right, and to focus on everybody's contribution. Everybody, right? Everybody has access, or equal access to the situation. And so quite honestly, at Torrance Learning, we didn't talk about race because I was taught that was not a relevant thing to talk about, an appropriate thing to talk about. And so then this summer, I have a deep conversation with Jess and another one of our colleagues, and find out that they're uncomfortable, or they were unsure whether or not they could talk to me about race, which was the last thing I wanted to do. That's not part of the culture that we create, but I hadn't made it comfortable to talk about because I never talked about it, right? So people ask me why I have a Black Lives Matter on my desk, and it's not performative. It is a signal that says, hi, you can talk to me about this. You don't have to, but if you want to, that's an okay thing to talk about. Jess, can you talk a little bit more about how we use that identities worksheet, and then and then how we might debrief that with our teams?
Yeah. So, and I also want to touch a little bit about socialization, because what you talked about, Megan, is your socialization around race, right? So when Megan called herself coming from an identity group that's historically centered, that's how we think about whiteness in America, right? Like it has historically taken center stage, right? That is what all the norms are set around. It's the standard for being. And when you fall outside of that standard, when you're marginalized, or you come from marginalized identities, what does it mean to show up in spaces where you might not fit into those norms or standards? And how do we make room for access, right? And so that exploring your identities activity helps you to think about all of the different social identities. And so Megan talked about intersectionality, right? Like I am a Black, fat, queer, cis woman, right? I grew up in poverty. I've now established myself in a middle class, but still carry a lot of debt. And I am a millennial, so like in the workforce. So all of those things intersect in the way that I enter spaces, in the way that I'm received in spaces, and how I negotiate or present myself in spaces where those identities are not centered, right? So what that activity does with your team is is really start to identify the blind spots, right? One of the conversations that I had with Megan early on was I'm not a morning person. So when I used to commute to Chelsea, it's about, some days it would be an hour and a half, some days it's an hour. And I would have to blast my music, the type of music I like to listen to wake up so that I'm ready to get to work when I get there. And when I would enter Chelsea, so Chelsea is a very rural, very white area, and I'm from Detroit, which is a very urban, majority Black city. I turn my music down. I turn my music down because I know how the perception, and that is my experience every day going into work, right? I understand what people perceive of me. And having that conversation with Megan, she was like, oh, I've never had that experience or had to think about it in that way, right? And it made her think about, what does access look like for Chelsea for Black folks, right? And so when you do the activity to think about your social identities, you can start to think about, oh, there are things I don't think about regularly that could be affecting my team, could be affecting the work that I'm doing, and could be affecting my impact in ways that could be positive or negative and cause harm. The other thing that exploring identities and how it creates access or presents barriers offers is an opportunity for connection. Because another thing that Megan and I connected on was, we're both women. And what does it mean to be navigating ed tech or entrepreneurship or business as women, right? And being able to have shared experiences. So you don't only want to focus on those differences amongst your team, but finding the common ground and how you can have shared experiences as well. And that activity is in your resource guide, and it is a great way to build relationships with your team. I will put the caveat that if your team does not have a high sense of psychological safety or rapport, it's probably better to outsource the facilitation to someone who has experience with intergroup dynamics that can lead your team through an effective dialogue.
Yeah, and I think that's really key, because these can be uncomfortable conversations, and we start getting to we start getting into some uncomfortable spaces. So Lisa's got a fantastic segue for us, Jess. For those of us who are freelancers or work alone, right? And so you're reaching into organizations in support of them. How do you suggest we use something like this with our clients and other practitioners? The identities worksheet, right? I think I would say that's great for you yourself, right? To understand how you're coming into that space. Depending on your relationship with your client, it's a long-standing relationship. You may or may not be able to kind of work in that particular activity, but you can use that to help your own self-awareness. When we get into the actions that we take and the cultures we support, then there are some things, because of our L&D role, that we have the ability to bring in, right? So there's two things, and let's touch, Jess, on, let's do in the take action space. Let's, for this group, focus on some of those media choices, right? And think about those. I can bring up the pictures if we want to. And then when we get into the culture space, let's talk about how we can build teams and use techniques to bring in, whether it's our learner personas or we're looking at those spaces.
Yeah, Lisa, I think that's a great question. So thanks for asking. And when you think about taking action in your work and how you can collaborate with teams outside of your organization, right? That's honestly something that we grapple with every day as consultants with other teams. You also get to be the facilitator of learning for them, because maybe they're not even considering how identity shows up in the work that they're doing. With us, one of the approaches that we use, and I'm going to pull ahead a little bit to talk about that learning persona and then go into how that affects media selections. But we have in our resource guide a kind of checklist to think about. So you do your own personal exploration of your identities and how that presents barriers and access to opportunities for yourself. So essentially you're evaluating how you might have bias, right? Then when you're working with other folks or you're working on a project, you can do a similar activity to explore who your learners are or who will be taking your course or your modules, what identities they represent, right? And how it will affect their motivation in that course. So for example, if you're thinking about our learners might be 20% Black. I don't present as Black, I present as white. These are things that maybe I've never grappled with. If I make a misstep in my course where I maybe display an image that's anti-Black or a stereotypical depiction of a Black person, it could trigger something that demotivates them to engage in the rest of your course. And so that's a consideration that you should be making with your client, with your design teams, with your builders, with everyone, to think about how your selections and decisions throughout the course can affect people based on their identities. And that's a step that we've added into our process. And some of our clients haven't thought about that before. But every client that I've personally worked with where we do that activity, they get a lot of value from that reflection. And then after you've kind of done that development, you can start to be really critical and conscious around your media selection. So we have outlined a few high-level tips for selecting media that's relevant and equitable in your resources. And one is evaluating who's standard. Remember, we talked about who we're centering here, right? And so a lot of times, actually, I just found the stat, there are only 3% of graphic designers are Black. And so when you think about who's doing all the graphic design, it is often coming from a white perspective, right? That's just an issue with representation. And so when we have whiteness as the standard, it shows up in a myriad of ways. It shows up in the way that bodies are positioned when you have group photos, where we might have pay attention to who's the leader, who's the boss, who's the spokesperson, right? And a lot of times that person is a white individual. It shows up in our graphics. We have a graphic that has multiple races represented. All of the people, they just colored the skin, but the characteristics. So like Black folks have wider bridge nose or curly textured hair.
Do you want me to show this?
Yeah, maybe we could show that. Yep.
Yeah.
It is very clear that there's not been thought given to reflecting Blackness as a standard. And so Megan's going to pull that up for us so that we can actually see. And then we'll walk through a few more examples. Yep, we can see your screen, Megan. Perfect. Yep. So you see here, we have multiple graphics. There are only a few that are represented as folks of color. And the hair textures are all consistent. They're not really showing a kinky, curly texture. They're also not really showing a darker complected individual here. So you can see that they've kind of taken a white graphic and just changed the skin color without really considering what it means to have a Black aesthetic.
In fact, and there's only 3 people of color here, which I've seen Caucasian people achieve nearly this shade with just a really great tan. Right? So we're very white centered. Do you want to do the next one?
Yep. So then and I acknowledge this is something I'm acutely aware of as a light-skinned individual. Usually close proximity to whiteness is more well-received, palatable, and digestible. And that means that I get easier access to things. People feel more comfortable and safe with me, right? I recognize that. I recognize my light skin privilege. This shows up in our media, where this could be perceived as a great representation of a woman of color. The photo is focused on her, right? She is in the front of the photo, but what type of diverse representation is reflected here? Are we reflecting a diverse range of skin colors, or are we centering on light skinned folks who have softer texture curls that feel more palatable and closer to white, right? So those are things that we need to think about as well.
Jess, do we want to talk about some of the other dynamics going on here?
Yeah, and the other aspect to consider, so I actually do, as my side hustle, content marketing. And one of the things that I hear when I'm working with brands is around hues and color and brightness. Well, in my culture, bright colors look good with melanated skin. So when we're thinking about what looks good on melanin, it's not the softer, pale, muted tones. And a lot of corporate standards when it comes to marketing and media are more muted, lighter, dim tones. And so then again, whose culture gets to be reflected in the media that we center in our resources? And that's a question that we can be constantly grappling with. Is it a branding standard about why we're using more muted tones, or is it something we've been socialized to believe is better and superior?
I'm gonna just so because I know we can't. We Jess and I have a huge bank of these. I'm gonna call. I think the next two, Jess, are really useful for you. So I'm gonna do. I'm gonna point out something from here, right? The leader in this, right? Take a look at this. There are two people who might be the boss, right? This guy over here. He's the only one standing. He's got the board. He's the one presenting, right? He is a candidate for the boss, although currently nobody's looking at him, right? This is the guy that everybody's looking at, right? So while yes, we have some racial diversity in here, she also does not have the power in this space. In fact, she's not even engaged in this conversation. So we then get into a much deeper look at how these things play out in this when you start looking at some of the stock art that you have.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then this comes in with when you're thinking about review. How are you evaluating what those depictions look like and whose perspectives are in that review? So what we suggest is that you have someone who has a lens or a perspective around DEI who's checking for that in your review, finding potential bias that might show up, finding misalignment. So here is, I see a lot of hand graphics in social media everywhere right now, and the palms, I like my melanin is here, but my palm is lighter. And so when you think about what's actually displaying the human elements of who's actually in charge of reviewing elements that display human characteristics of Blackness, right? We want to make sure that we're always humanizing folks of color and diverse folks, and not doing anything that could signal we weren't considering, right? Because even though this might be a simple oversight, it could signal to someone that you didn't consider me, that it's dehumanizing because you don't even know what my body looks like, and it could lead to demotivation in the engagement.
And so this, right, I'll call in my majority culture colleagues here, right? This is a case in which not only, right, if an image like this gets through, right, not only was it a mistake by the person who, and a lack of perspective and understanding by the person who created it, but it was also clear that nobody of color reviewed this,
mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Not this one, obviously, because this was created by somebody who was aware. But there's if you don't have that within yourself, right? If you know that is a blind spot of yours, to have that checked, right? It's just like if you know you've got bad grammar and spelling, you get a proofreader.
Love Molly.
Let's do one more.
Yeah, this is actually my was most surprising, because what we wanted to show was how we can have stereotypical depictions that actually are racist or anti-Black, or and we wanted to look up theft or shoplifting, right? When I searched theft or or shoplifting on Adobe stock, I didn't find one image that centered a Black person. And to me, that signaled like, oh, Adobe stock is aware. They're ready. They're like kind of combating the stereotypes. They're doing their part. But then when I searched tech teams, right, or a more positive representation could reflect Black folks, most of them didn't include any people of color. So here is an example of one of the tech teams that we pulled. And so I think that we're often hyper aware, vigilantly so, about being counter stereotypical, right? It's easy for us to know we shouldn't reflect Black folks as the negative character in our scenarios. That's something that we should know those things, right? Maybe we don't, but I think that that's based off of what Adobe, that's the norm. But also, how are we elevating, amplifying, and showcasing in positive light those folks as well? That also is counter stereotypical, right? Like we need to be positioning Black folks in roles of CEOs in our scenarios. We need to be thinking about how we're changing the power dynamic and shifting the narrative so that we're creating change and not just complicit within a status quo.
Well, and here's the other thing, Jess, that just fries me about this image on the right. We all know that's a staged image. That's not an actual team. Actual people working on a development job don't sit in chairs, right? Those are conference room chairs, not work chairs, right? We know this is staged for this.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And they didn't, right? What may be worse is that every time I look at this, I think this person may be a person of color.
Mm-hmm.
And they're the one that got chopped out of the photo, right? So I mean, there's some issues here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as we look at some of these things, right? And they're also never that happy, Lisa, right? Exactly. I think there's so much that we can learn about, right? But also be overwhelmed with, right?
Mm-hmm,
Completely overwhelmed, because now we're starting to talk about really looking deeply into every image, right? I've gone back to my presentations that I've tried really hard to do a good job with, and I'm like, yes, right? That does have, right, showing racial diversity, but they're all dressed, right, like majority culture people, right? So I mean, these are really, really tricky. So Toddy, actually, we do have in that resource guide, and I'll paste that in again. We do have links to some great image sites and a few articles. Jess also has an entire bibliography if you want the entire bibliography. And there's so much out there, but there's a lot going on, right? So let's, as we kind of close this out, and I really appreciate all of the questions and feedback as we've gone. If there are specific questions or things you'd like to talk about, like let's jump in here in the chat. But Jess, let's talk about some of the things that either as contractors or as even non-leaders, right? Let's talk about non-leaders in an L&D team. What can just everyday people do? And that really gets to our culture, right? Our third piece.
Yeah. So I think I can speak from my perspective and what we've been able to accomplish at Torrance Learning, and how we've been able to learn together. But in the resource guide, there are a ton of things that we can do as individuals. In fact, I think it's 3 pages, the checklist at this point. And again, we want to say that checklist is non-exhaustive. It's something that we're continuing to grow as we learn and as folks contribute. But I think that as individuals, it's one of the things I love that Megan does, and I recognize that she is in a leadership role, is to be honest and transparent about where you are in your learning journey. It really does start with you. When we say build the foundation is really about about you learning about how you benefit from these systems and how you might be perpetuating them in your work. And that means that you have to be, and I say we all have to be ready for feedback and to be held accountable. It's called unconscious bias for a reason. We don't know about it. And so when it comes up and someone calls you on it or gives you feedback or tries to hold you accountable to learning, be prepared for that. One, emotionally, understand that it's not our fault. We've all been socialized in a world that centers white folks, right? And so as we have to dismantle and unpack that, it's hard work. So recognize the emotional labor that has to go into that, but really think about how you're going to be ready to receive feedback. And then when you are ready to receive feedback, and when you do receive feedback, because it will come, listen empathetically, listen to understand, and don't expect folks to be teaching you on how to make changes. Once you listen, go on and do the research and do the work, and reach out to resources that exist in your network. And then after you've kind of like done your work, and it never ends, right? Like things are constantly changing. 10 years ago, when I started DEI work, we weren't really having language to hold space for my trans siblings, right? So like things are changing constantly, and recognize that. Start to really evaluate the way you collaborate on your team. Right? When folks come in who might have different experiences than you, how are you open to receive that? How are you engaging with them? If you don't have access to diverse teams, which is a reality for some of us that are in more homogenous communities, how can you create opportunities to collaborate with outside communities? How can you engage with diverse media, right? Like who are you reading? Whose design are you looking at and developing the standard for? Who are you paying as your vendors? Really start to think about all of those collaboration efforts, and then continue the conversation. So at Torrance Learning, one of the things that we've done is we developed the foundation. Our full team has taken that, and it's not just a one and done, right? So now we have a book club at our all hands meeting where we're talking about how to talk about race, right? And we're building that into conversations ongoing, and ensuring that we're continuing to learn together. And the other thing is, when you're doing your sprints and your review, incorporate a DEI perspective. It might be something that you don't have right now, but maybe it's something that you're building as you learn. So the feedback shouldn't ever stop, and you should be consistently evaluating.
And we could go on and on, but we need to give you a break. So this has been fantastic, and I appreciate everybody joining us in here. And I know I think Jess and I can go and hang out a little bit in the lounge. But I want to thank everybody for being here. Thank Luis for inviting us in. And I think Luis is arriving to be able to share all with us some more instructions.
Well, no, I wanted to close out the session, but I wanted to tell you, like this conversation and just hearing you guys talk about this is, for somebody like me, is kind of liberating. And I think that, to sort of relate it to TLDC, some of you have been around TLDC for a while, for like 4 years, maybe 5 years. And the first year of TLDC, I kind of quietly sort of sat in the background and watched how it was developing. And then I sort of had to quietly change the way that we were bringing on guests. And that change was really, for me, was to focus on diversifying the voices that we were bringing into the broadcast. Because initially, the way that, like having worked in this space for a long time, I saw it forever, just sort of the way that programs were being built. And I would, I'm somebody that I would look at, a flyer or a brochure, and I'm like, oh, there's nobody there that looks like me. And it was a constant thing. And the thing is I don't talk about it. I just have, I just sort of do it. And I I was afraid of talking about it or making that statement. But, the fact that you're bringing this up now, Megan and Jessica, thank you so much. I mean, it is liberating for me. It feels very courageous. And, Torrance Learning, especially somebody that has like basically defined XAPI for L&D and just really helped like form, or just that relationship, how much you've done for L&D. You're like a learning leader, according to, on the advisory board for the guild. It's great to see this, and I'm excited for the future of people like me in this industry. So thank you so much. And that's it. So everybody, thanks again. Make sure you hang out at the tables, go visit the expo. I'm really excited about that component, and I'd love for you to be able to support the vendors. And next session should be coming up shortly. Take care, everybody. Thanks again, Jessica, Megan.